Welcome everyone to another edition to As Above, So Below Radio. I'm your host, Martin Hodgson, and it gives me great pleasure to have you tuning in today. When you get a chance, please visit the website, holisticadvocate.com, and sign up for my free newsletter. Also, take a moment to subscribe and become a member. You'll not only gain access to my commercial-free subscriber-based interviews, but also treat yourself to an assortment of fascinating people worth listening to. Today's guest is Miriam Delicado. After having had several encounters with extraterrestrials who imparted information to her, Miriam has written a book which details her journeys to the southwest area of the United States and her encounters with the Hopi People. Along the way, she shares her insight as to why she feels she was groomed to help awaken humanity, that we are not alone in the universe. Most importantly, she emphasizes that we need to pay attention to what we're doing to the planet or face dire consequences that could have an impact on all of us. Join me in welcoming Miriam as she discusses the Hopi Blue Star Prophecy. First of all, Miriam, I want to give you a warm welcome here for being on As Above, So Below Radio. Now, before we begin, for any of our listeners out there who may not know as to who you are, can you give a brief background about yourself and what got you started to follow the path that you're on?
Yes. Well, first of all, thank you for having me on the program.
Sure.
It's great to be here, have another opportunity to share with people from around the world. My experience began in 1988, where I had an encounter on a highway in British Columbia, Canada, with tall, blonde-haired, blue-eyed extraterrestrials. And this experience was really spiritually moving for me, brought me to a very large understanding of, I guess, myself and humanity and the very existence of life itself. Mm-hmm. And I have been led over the last 25 years to really be introspective regarding my own life and the life that's around me. And it's led me to working with different indigenous people and starting a nonprofit that is focused on how it is that we can work in unity in a peaceful, positive way to support the natural world and also support humanity itself.
Mm-hmm. Now, you also have a website called alienbluestar.com. Is that correct?
It's bluestarprophecy.com, mm-hmm. And yeah, that's the website that I have a blog through, and I share just different information from these beings, some of the experiences that I've had, and just a way to communicate with the public, bluestarprophecy.com.
Okay. And you've also written a book called Blue Star, Fulfilling Prophecy. And
yes.
Yeah, and for the most part, the interview is regarding your mission here and the book and so forth. So I want to begin with your story at a young age. Did you always know that you were an empath, an intuitive?
Well, when I was very, very, very young, of course I never talked to people about this, but when I was very, very, very young, mm-hmm. I remember, for example, just driving in the car with my parents. We're talking about being like 2 years old, 3 years old, in around that age. Mm-hmm. And looking at people that were just on the sidewalk. And I would look at them and I would try to listen to what they were thinking. And sometimes I remember looking at people thinking, oh, I don't like what they're thinking. And I would look away from them because I didn't like to hear what it was that they were thinking. So these abilities really came out of me at a very, very, very young age. And I think that it manifested throughout my life as I got a little bit older in just being a very caring person to the people that were around me. In respect to, I was always friends with the underdogs in school, and I would always stand up for people who were getting picked on and this kind of thing. I never really talked about this other aspects of myself where I would see things because I thought that it was my imagination. I thought as I got older it was just my imagination.
Mm-hmm. Now, did you ever see any lights or any orbs or hear any voices around you by any chance?
When I was very, very, very young, it's a bit of a complicated story because when I was very young, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, I remember just feeling a little bit different than the other people even around me, even from my own family in certain ways. And by the time I was about 10 years old, I was starting to have really profound and strange dreams that, of course, now I can reflect back and realize that I was entering into the dream world or into other dimensions, as people might say, or the astral world, and having communication with different beings and different entities that were out there. And then, of course, as I got a little bit older, it's kind of like having to go through a timeline to really understand my experiences, because by the time I was, I believe, 17, 18 years old, this, quote, psychic ability was really, really strong in my life. And I was doing all sorts of things, from being able to remote view, and a quick story about how that took place was a friend of mine had been missing for 3 days, and my other friend said, well, sit down and see if you can see where she is. So I saw her in a car that was a certain color, a certain look, with an older man, and they were driving to the next town over from where I lived. And I said, no, she's fine. She'll be back tomorrow. And sure enough, we found out that that's exactly what had happened. But I'd never met this man that she was with. I didn't know who he was, and I'd never seen his car before. So it was, there were a lot of confirmations around these teenage years with this psychic ability that I had. And it was a little frightening for me because, of course, back then, not a lot of people talked about this type of thing. They didn't even have the slightest understanding of it. So I was very isolated. And then by the time I was 22 years old was when I had the experience with physically being taken on board a UFO, a craft, in 1988. With these tall, blonde-haired, blue-eyed extraterrestrials. Now, when I was with them, a lot of information from my past, from those early childhood years, came back to me. Memories did. And at first I thought, oh, I'm crazy. This is crazy. This can't be real. It can't be right. But over the years, every memory that I got back has been confirmed by other people. And it hasn't been confirmed in a way of me telling them the story and them saying, yeah, that's what happened. It was me kind of asking non-leading, and this is very important, non-leading questions, and then they ended up confirming that the experiences that I had at a very young age were factual. I understand that you read part of my story.
Well, matter of fact, I had finished the book just about a couple of hours before this interview, and I had emailed you that, today's what, Friday? Wednesday night, I had this unusual dream. In my mind's eye, I had seen this young Native American boy who had the most peculiar, large but bright blue eyes. And then I saw another photo of the same young boy as an adult. And the impression I got, the message I got was that he was kept in the community by the elders because had he grown up, let's say out there in the public, so to speak, he probably would have been bullied, probably attacked because of his different appearance and so forth among the other kids. So the elders decided to educate him in the community, and he had grown up to be, from what I interpret, as an important scientist who was going to be important to his people.
Mhm.
And I thought, wow, this is an unusual dream, you know. But yes, I wanted to share that with you. But I want to ask you this. When you had that experience, when you were 22 years old, did you actually contemplate that you were a star person? That you had actually, let's say, belonged out there as opposed to, let's say, being with your family?
Well, when I was very, very, very young, even when I was a very young child, I didn't feel as though I was part of my family.
Mm-hmm.
When I got older, that just became even stronger. I just
Right.
felt separated from them in some way. And I am part of my family. I do have the DNA of my mother. I do have the DNA of my father. I have traits from both sides. There's no question of that. But I do believe that I have DNA that is extraterrestrial as well.
Mm-hmm.
And there's no question about that. And the idea that I was from somewhere else, I always felt like I said, disconnected from family, disconnected from even other people. And I thought it was kind of odd because it wasn't like a terrible feeling, but it was just something that was present in my life. And then when I had the experience in '88 with the encounter, that actually came up in our, let's call it a dialogue that we had with these beings. And it was very clear that I was not from here, that part of my soul itself was from another star system. Mm-hmm. And that aspect of self, the aspect of the soul that chose to come here, for example, doesn't normally incarnate onto the earth.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
So there was always this feeling of being disconnected. And when the star beings told me this, and they were explaining this to me in great, almost scientific details in a way, and timelines and history in the way that a history teacher would teach history, they were telling me the history of different parts of my life and the parts of humanity and parts of them. And this, in fact, just solidified this notion that I wasn't quite from here, that this is where this disconnect came from. And so I want to point out before we go any further that this doesn't mean that I have the greatest love and honor and admiration for humanity, and that I am human. I am still a human being. Mm-hmm. It just means that part of my essence of my soul and life has had other existence, is what it means.
Right. Well, I had mentioned that term star person because I remember back in the, I would say early 90s, mid 90s, this term was just used left and right. Now, mm-hmm. for those listeners who are not fully aware, the term star person is often associated with several characteristics, some of which the following include, and I'm going to just list some of these characteristics, an obsession with the stars and outer space, having an imaginary childhood friend, attraction to the colors green, blue, and purple, acute hearing that's above the average hearing range, the desire to get away from normal people, to either be alone or seek others who share their beliefs, extreme sensitivity to alcohol, medication, or drugs, dreams involving flying out of the body or astral projecting, prophetic dreams or visions that come to pass, telepathic communications with animals, and the most prominent being an empath, having unusual eyes and a longing to go back home. So, so you knew you were different, Miriam. So I want to ask you, what kept you grounded throughout this?
That is just the best question to ask. Thank you. Because it's an extremely important aspect of this phenomenon, mm-hmm. and one that often gets left out of the conversation and dialogue. So, wow, I'm very grateful for that question. Well, You know, I have to admit that for the first couple of years after this experience, it was so profound, and there was so much knowledge that was, what I say, placed in me. And I'm going to explain this first, if I may.
Sure.
When you want to learn about rock climbing, okay, I use this as one example. When you want to learn about rock climbing, one of the first things that you may do is get some books on the subject matter. And when you have those books on the subject matter, you're going to take them and you're going to read and you're going to understand everything. And maybe find a friend that's interested in rock climbing and sit and talk with them and then learn a little bit more. You could do this for 10 years and you could be, quote, an expert on rock climbing. However, until you actually go out onto the rock face and do the climbing itself, you don't fully comprehend and understand what it means to rock climb because you haven't had the experience. So when you're with these beings, one of the things that they do, which makes it so intense and difficult to handle spiritually, emotionally, physically, is that they give you these experiences. Instead of just showing you a picture of something or telling you something, they're giving you the actual experience of these things. So it's very, very difficult to, as you just asked, to keep grounded. So the first 2 years after 1988, I have to admit that I was not grounded. I mean, I was just out there, connected to everything. I couldn't walk past people without hearing their thoughts. I had visions constantly. I had dreams constantly. I had telepathic communication. And what I did was I did seek out other people like myself. And I did find a very few of us that were out there at the time. This was in Vancouver, British Columbia. And I really tried hard to recognize that I had to be very cautious. This was one of the most important messages that these beings gave, was that things are not as they appear to be. And that's still the message today from them. Things are not as they appear to be. So always question everything. And I used that to ground myself. Is this from my imagination or is this real? How can I do that? And one of the first things that I realized was if I read books on the subject matter, it would taint my ability to find ultimate truth. Because then I would never be constantly questioning myself. Did I read that from the book or did that come from me? Did I hear that from that person or did that come from within me? Now there's no ability to have a confirmation of what you're experiencing as truth or real. And so that was one of the things that I did to keep myself grounded, was always question myself, to recognize that I am a human being in a human body, and that although I have this quote extraterrestrial alien, they go by many names, although I have that DNA and those markers in me, how can I remain humble with what I have and what I know and what I think I know? Because I could be wrong, and I have to be very humble with myself to recognize that I could be wrong. And that kept me grounded, rather than coming out and saying, I know this. No, sometimes I'd say that. I'll say, you know what, I know this. I absolutely know it. But it doesn't mean that you're going to know it. And it doesn't mean that I can make you know it. Right. I'm just sharing this is my truth. So it's like using basic tools to keep myself grounded. And the thing is that for between 1991 approximately and 2003, I never talked about this at all. It was that whole span of time. I never spoke to anyone about it. I never sought out anyone. I never sought out any kind of communities or people that delved into anything esoteric, spiritual, nothing along those lines whatsoever, because I needed to bring myself to just a place where I was comfortable with the knowledge that I had been gifted with.
Right.
That's a big question,
Right.
and an important one for this community.
Okay, well, and adding to your experiences, there was your father who, from what I can best interpret, was a disciplinarian, which ultimately caused you to go out on your own. But
Hmm.
would it be safe to speculate that your father was actually a visionary, that he helped forge the path that you're on now?
Mm, well, the history of my father is very interesting. In reading, I've talked about this in the book, uh, just briefly saying that after I had this experience in '88,
Mm-hmm.
I went to talk to my father, and I did not talk to him about, quote, aliens. Okay, that needs to be very clear.
Mm-hmm.
I only spoke to him about my psychic experiences
Mm-hmm.
and how profoundly accurate they were and what was happening to me at that time. And we did not speak. I think it had been years since we spoke, and then I went to him and I talked to him about these things. And he flipped out on me. He went just crazy, and he said, why didn't you tell me? And he goes, what is it that's going on with you? And then I told him about the ET encounter, and I barely touched on it.
Mm-hmm.
And he told me that, he said, why didn't you tell me sooner? Maybe I could have helped you. He said, the worst they ever were with me was, at that time, 25 years ago. And what that comment did was it confirmed something very profound, was my suspicions that he had had experiences. It confirmed it right there without me asking him. But it confirmed something else, was a childhood memory that I had received in 1988 at 22 years of age, where these beings allowed me to remember them and beings hovering around me in the middle of the night as a baby. So I was 25 years old when I told him the story, my father, the very brief, I told him in 5 minutes what happened.
Mm-hmm.
And he just went, oh my God, the worst they ever were with me. It was 25 years ago, and that confirmed everything for me. And that's when I realized, back in the early 90s, was that he also confirmed by that one statement. He also confirmed the DNA story that they had relayed to me, that the ETs had relayed to me about the DNA of humanity and how they're watching certain family lineages,
Mm-hmm.
to watch the DNA and the progression of the DNA. And it confirmed so much for me. It was overwhelming. My father was a psychic also. He often would tell us about different visions and things that he saw, and it was kind of scary when we were kids. They used to call him, some really derogatory names because he was a healer.
Mm-hmm.
And he used herbs and natural ways of healing to heal people, and he was a great healer.
Mm-hmm.
He was a great healer. He healed so many people naturally,
Right.
even cancer.
Mm-hmm.
And my father just passed away on April 17th, a couple of months ago, so he's just recently gone to the other side.
Right.
But he did bring me, it's a very complex, as you read in the book. It's a simple story, simple. But the complexity of it and where it reaches out to and branches out to is profound.
Well, I'm asking this because some of the possible events, as told by to you by your father, actually came to pass with Fukushima. With the radiation following the Earth's air currents. And you mentioned in the book that let's see, he had been approached to join the Russian psychic army.
Mm-hmm.
Can you go over that story for our listeners here? I mean, he warned you to never, even consider going there.
Right.
Can you just touch upon that?
Well, it was very strange.
Mm-hmm.
As a child growing up, he was in the war. He was in the Second World War in Europe, and he's from the former Yugoslavia. And so he was over there fighting during the time. He was very young, and he had a lot of different experiences. One of them he used to tell us, and he told me repeatedly. I mean, I can't even count how many times.
Right.
He would say to me, now I remember once, I even remember where we were standing because he was so almost angry about it. When I was very young, this was before I was even 9 years old. I can say that because of where we were, but he said, now I'm going to tell you a story and you have to remember, do you understand? And he would drill it into me, and he said when he was in the war, the Russians came to him, and the Russians wanted him to join them for a program that he called, quote, the Russian Psychic Army. And he said to me, if these people ever approach you, don't ever go with them, because if you go with them, you can never leave. And he looked at me and he said, even if you think you can leave, they can find you wherever you are on the planet with their minds. They will get a group of them together, and they will find you wherever you are in the world. And he said, and he was so, like, imagine a small child hearing this.
Right.
They will kill you with their minds. And I was like, he said, they don't even have to touch you. They can just kill you with their minds. And I was like, oh my gosh. So I heard this story repeatedly over and over and over again, okay? Yes, I understand. Yes, I will remember. So fast forward to, I left home when I was pretty much 12, okay? It's a long, sad story. I left home pretty much when I was 12. So there hasn't been a lot of talk in there with my father from 12 to 22. And when I was 22 years old and I had this experience, shortly after this, I was working and I never told anyone this story. Why would I tell anyone this story, right, about my father? I'm standing in a yogurt shop working at 22, 23 years old, and this man walked in off the street, off of Robson Street in Vancouver, walked in the store, walked directly up to me, looked me straight in the eye, and without a blink, without another word, with nothing, he just walked in and looked right at me and said, do you work for the CIA or the FBI? And I said, no. He said, have you ever worked for the, and I knew, I clicked in right away. I was like, oh dear God, they're here. And he said, have you ever worked for the CIA or the FBI? And I said, no. And I was trying to just act like a stupid 22-year-old, like young child. And he just didn't buy it. And he pushed and he said, have you ever thought about working with the Russians? And I said, no. And he got into some detail, and he started saying, well, we want to know if you'd like to come and work with us. We work with a secret program where we work with approximately 10,000 psychics that we have in our community. It's a small community that we've built for people like yourself. You live there. You teach, you're taught there. We give you all of the skills that you need, all these things. He said, have you ever thought about it? And I said, no, I'm not interested. And he kept kind of pushing a little bit. And I finally just looked at him and I said, please, to whoever it is that sent you here, please go back to them and thank them very much for their interest. But I would like you to send a message back to them and tell them that I am not interested now, nor will I ever be interested ever in the future, and that it is absolutely pointless to ever come back and ask me this question again, because I will never work with you. But I am very grateful for and honored by the offer. That's kind of, what I said to him. Because I knew that I couldn't be crazy. I had to be diplomatic. And this was happening. It was real. Just saying it right now because of my father's death, it's a little bit emotional for me.
Right. Right.
Just because he died.
Right. Well, we have my sincere condolences on the passing of your father. It sounds to me that the Russians were probably, maybe I'm wrong here, were probably ahead of themselves because it sounds to me that they had a remote viewing program, considering that they can group together and find anywhere or anyone virtually on the planet, you know.
Right.
But I want to go back here. Let's see, when you were growing up here, I would say, I think you mentioned around the age of 4 or 5, you had cited that you were led into a field to board an alien craft where you were strapped and told that, you know, they were cleaning, or in this case, changing your blood to protect you from the onset of diseases coming in the near future. And this was way back in probably, what, 1970, 71. Do you remember what types of diseases these ETs had warned you about? Was there any hint as to what was going to come about in the future?
Well, okay, if I may.
Sure.
Just to share one thing about my father before we move on.
Sure, absolutely.
He did tell me that they tried to recruit him during the Second World War into the psychic program. So we're going all the way back to the 50s.
Mm-hmm.
You know, 40s, 50s, that this was already taking place. And they and so just to say that.
Mm-hmm.
And so this experience that I had when I was 4 years old, this is very interesting, actually, because, okay, I grew up as a child without this memory. There was no thought of this. Mm-hmm. When I was 22 and I had the encounter in 1988, this memory all came back to me. Not immediately. It came back in the following couple of days after being with these beings. It was still downloading all of this information into me. And I remembered an experience where I walked out of the house with my sister who's 2 years older, and we walked into the farmer's field that was right in front of our house, and then above what I called the barn was a very large, hovering, looked like more light than a silvery, glowing craft. You know, it was just more like light than anything else. Mm-hmm. And an orb, a blue orb, which is a blue ball of light, shot out from the center of it and came to me and sort of stopped in front of me and then went up my body and down my body and then did the same thing to her. And then when it got to her, it beamed her in the head with light. And then she turned around, went back to the house. I went on board the craft. Now, when I was on board the craft, the memory that came back was, you know, I have to say that it was pure pain, because they put tubes, something that it looked like just like a needle, nothing more, into both of my arms and my forearms. And they were very, very, very painful, and they said that it felt like I was being blown up like a balloon. And they said that they were changing my blood to protect me from diseases in the future. And I thought, well, what is this? Now, I don't remember clearly what that complete response was. All I know is that diseases would be coming, and all I can do is make assumptions from that. I can't I can make an assumption. And the assumption is that there's man-made man-made pathogens that were going to be coming in the future. Some people have asked me if this happened to be AIDS as being one of them, and that could very well be. Mm-hmm. There's a few others that have been coming into, coming out in the last couple of years. What's that one that had to do with the chickens, and that took place? That was in the last couple of years.
Yeah. I know what you're talking about. Yeah.
Yeah, there's a few different ones that have come out, and I'm like, I wonder if I'd be protected. So I really don't know.
Right.
But this time when I was 4 years old is fascinating. Mm-hmm. It is extremely fascinating.
Right.
Because again, I was 22 when that memory came back, so I never said anything to my sister. years later, I said to her, "Do you ever remember anything strange?" That's how I opened the question. These are non-leading questions. She said, "Yeah, I remember a light hanging over the barn."
Mm-hmm.
And I said, "Yeah." And this memory would come and go, and I never told her the story. Never told her the story of the beam of the blue light, of the blue orb, and how it beamed her in the head. Never told her any of that. So it took, I think, 14 or 15 years or something. I don't even remember. It was a very long time.
Right.
And over this time period, over these years, I would just ask her, "Do you ever remember?" And so she would say, "Yeah, I remember the light." Then I would go to her again 6 months later. "You remember the light?" She's like, "I don't know what you're talking about."
Huh.
6 months later, I'd say, "Do you remember the light?" She'd say, "Yeah, I remember the light." And then she would remember another piece of the story.
Right.
So it would be like this bouncing back and forth, either no memory at all, or when the memory did come, it would be one layer more. But I never told her the details.
Mm-hmm.
So finally, at the very end of all of this, 17 years later, I think, or something along those lines, it was a very long time,
Mm-hmm.
17, 20 years later, it was a long time.
Mm-hmm.
She wrote it down in a story for her studies in school that she was doing. She was had to do write a short story for school. She used this as the story. And I laughed at her and I said, "Oh, so now you're going to finally remember this." She goes, "What are you talking about?" I said, and then that's when I told her, "You keep forgetting and then remembering." I said, "Now that you've written it down, now you should remember." And she said, "Oh, okay." But she didn't write down the last little bit. She still had to finish writing it out. Well, in that time, the very last thing that she forgot was the blue beam of light.
Mm-hmm.
And now she has no memory of it, and I don't believe it'll ever come back.
Right.
So that was one thing. The second thing that's very profound about that experience was that 40 years later, I believe it was, 39, 40 years later, oh no, I'm sorry, that's not right. 35 years later? Sorry, I'd have to sit down because I tell the story all the time, but
Mm-hmm.
my math and everything for the timeline is convoluted. I always have to sit down and think about it.
Right.
Regardless, it was over 30 plus years later.
Mm-hmm.
I was sitting down with some people who were childhood friends, and it was the parents of this childhood friend, and I told them about my experience. And they said to me, "Oh my gosh, I remember that this man that lived down the street from us, for 2 years, he would not shut up." That's exactly what she said. He would just not shut up. He would talk all the time about this UFO that he said hovered over the barn for hours. And I looked at her, and I mean, again, can you imagine the confirmation and affirmation of what she was saying to me?
Mm-hmm. Right.
I said to her, "How long? How old? What year was that?" She said, "I don't know." I said, "Well, think of how old your daughter was, because she's the same age as me." And then she figured out the age and the year, and we did a little math and this and that, and we figured out that I would have been 4 years old.
Mm-hmm.
And see, I could never figure out if I was 4 or if I was 5.
Right.
And from that conversation, we figured out that I was 4 years old,
Mm-hmm.
that this raging alcoholic was the only one that saw it, and that he talked about it for 2 years. So again, it's total confirmation that what took place was real.
Right. Now, you
It's
also
fascinating.
Yeah, you also mentioned, which I find curious, that these beings had encounters with what appeared to be military personnel, correct? At that
Yes.
age. Now, it's my understanding that typically the military, or any U.S. military in particular, they work exclusively with negative ETs. Usually with an agenda. But these beings, from what I can interpret, these were benevolent, right? So,
Right. Well, I think that may be explained because the memory that I had about them meeting with this, there was a whole bunch of different crafts that were landing there. It wasn't just ours.
Okay. All right.
So it was some kind of meeting that was taking place.
And you were told, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead, please.
You were told that you would one day be at these meetings with the ETs and, let's say, the military?
Right.
Huh. Okay.
Well, they said that one day, that one day in the future, maybe I would be able to participate.
Mm-hmm.
The implication, because when speaking to these beings, it's very difficult to understand them.
Right.
Because sometimes it's more of a metaphor that they might be trying to give you, or I mean, this is why this whole subject matter is so convoluted and mixed up and confused from every side. Because I didn't feel that they were working with the military. I didn't actually feel that.
Mm-hmm.
I wouldn't say that they were necessarily working with them. They were meeting with them, but for what reason and what purpose, I don't know. But there was military types there, and there was different types of ETs that were there. The tall blondes were there, the ones that, but that memory is not really, it's not, I don't have a large portion of that memory intact. It was just very brief memory that I have of that.
Right.
But it is very interesting because, of course, we know that many of the beings have been working with the military, and that we do know that they have been working with different groups of people all over the planet. And I think that we need to use caution whenever we talk about these things, instead of boxing. And this is something that I'm very passionate about in this community, that we don't box things into one category, because it's not that simple. It's like saying, well, just because human beings are on the planet, they're all killing each other, because they're all, your taxes pay for a war somewhere, no matter who you are and where you are. So does that mean that you're part of it? So I guess the point is, just to say that all the ETs that are bad are working with the governments, and that this and that, and to have those assumptions is probably an assumption, and just that, and not actually fact. Because even with the tall blondes, I tell people, do not, just because they are tall with blonde hair and blue eyes, do not assume that they are good. You can't do that.
Right. Yes, because when people talk about the tall blondes, it's, there's this association with the Pleiadians. And maybe, I could be wrong here, but maybe the beings you interacted could have been the Pleiadians. It's hard to speculate, but they do fit in with that description.
Well, yes, and that's the thing. I've been asked so many times: is it the Pleiadians? Is it the Arcturians? Is it this? Is it that? Is it Nordics? Is it so forth? Yeah. And I will never answer that question.
They never told you as to who or what star system they were from, by any chance?
If they did, I don't remember.
Okay.
Again, I could make an assumption, and I think that I know, but I will not answer that question.
Right.
I've said that always, and partly. Even if I did know, I would never tell anyone.
Right.
Because, and the reason for that is because if I said that it was the Pleiadians, then all the information about the Pleiadians would all of a sudden be what I stand for, as the person having the experience.
Right.
And that just, I think, is wrong. I think we have to look at each person and take really what they are saying as what their experience, what their understanding capability is, what their perception is, and what their views are on the subject, and then weave it together with the rest of the community, with who it is that is looking at all of this. You understand what I'm saying?
Right, right. Okay. By the way, the pathogen that you might have referred to moments ago, I believe you might have been talking about what the avian virus, the avian flu. Was that the one?
Avian flu, yes.
Yeah, yeah. That's pretty nasty. Um, okay, well, the second key event you had while growing up occurred, of course, when you were at age 22.
Hmm.
It's my understanding that you knew these beings were coming for you.
Hmm.
Even more spooky from what I read was that everyone else in the car seemed as if they had been turned off. You see six beings walk out towards you, and you're led to another craft where two other
Hmm.
beings with long blonde hair and blue eyes meet you.
Right.
Um, Now, when you walked out, to see these ETs, did you perceptibly feel as if time had stood still? Did you notice any other cars out on the highway? Because usually when these events like these happen, it appears as if the ETs are able to suspend our perception of time, and manipulate the reality around them.
Well, there's a lot of stories about this,
Mhm.
a lot of observation in these experiences
Uh,
where one of the things that we know that takes place is when a physical craft comes, often there is complete silence. And it is a profound silence, as if there is no wind, no bugs, no birds, no life. It is just silent. It is a very unfamiliar silence that comes about.
mhm.
Uh, it is very interesting, going back to relating the question back to when I was 4, for example, where the only one that remembers anything was this alcoholic. And maybe it's because he was so drunk
Right.
that they couldn't manipulate him
Mhm.
in some way. Maybe his mind, his something was so off in him that they could not uh, turn off his brain.
Mhm.
And so these experiences, like for myself, the people in the car it was like they were turned off. It was like they were in suspended animation. It was I still can't find the words to put this together, um, to express, to the public what that was like.
Right.
And it did seem like time had stopped, because I'll tell you, I figured out later that I was with them for 3 hours. It took me some time to figure it out, but I did. I figured it out 3 hours.
Wow.
The amount of information that was given to me was like lifetimes. So it was as if I was with them for days and days and days, you know?
Mhm.
So it was very um it was very difficult, and that was a lot of why, processing all of this information, that I really did have to work very hard at staying grounded, for example.
Mhm.
So every piece of this ties in back in to a looping, picture of what people like myself are experiencing.
Mhm.
But I think ultimately the most important aspect of what we are experiencing is not even what we see, or not even what we feel or think, but the most profound aspect of the phenomenon is how we transform afterwards.
Right.
That's the most fascinating part of the phenomenon, and why the transformation takes place.
Mhm.
And that is a deeply, profoundly beautiful, spiritual um, experience
Right.
that we have.
Right. Well, I want to switch now and make a transition here. I mean, you begin to somehow eventually network with those in the UFO community. And you meet this guy named John who shows you a document titled Protocol for Extraterrestrial Contact that's
Hmm.
referencing MJ12. That's Majestic 12 for those who don't know. What were your thoughts on this after you had read the document?
Terror. Absolute terror. Absolute terror. I was so frightened after that. I admit that now, you know. When I was very young, you know, I think that was that was it for me. When that document came to me, I was done. That's when I stopped talking to the public. I stopped talking to everyone in the community. That was it. I stopped.
Right.
Because, you know, the Russians had just been on my front door, you know, asking me for, you know, to go be with them. I met all these different people that were telling me that they used to work for different government programs in the States, one of them being the acid programs that they did, the LSD programs, the hallucinogenic programs, the psychic programs. I mean, I was meeting all of these really interesting, let's say, people.
Right.
And, you know, people were coming by where I worked and just taking my photograph, and it was endless. But then the MJ-12 document, Protocol for Extraterrestrial Contact, came to me, and I can't remember how many pages it was. When I wrote my book, I had to reference back notes from before, so that's why sometimes I can't remember now. And we're really talking 25 years ago.
Right.
So it is difficult for me to remember all the tiny details at this point. But that document was read by myself and one other person. And at the end of it, he was my boyfriend at the time. And at the end of it, he was terrified.
Right.
He said to me, "What is this?" He said, "Oh my God." He said, "They're going to kill you." That's what he said. You know, he was terrified. I mean, really, he said, "They're going to kill you if they find out that you have this." And what was in it that was the most frightening was that there was I don't remember a lot of it. What I do remember is that they said that they would have camps for people like us. And, of course, there's a lot of talk about that today.
Right.
I don't want to get into it, though. They said that people who had been proven to have extraterrestrial contact could be taken by the government, held without any trial, held without any no formal charges of anything, and you know, just to be studied. They could even be cut into pieces if that's what they wanted to do. They could study them scientifically if that's what they chose to do.
Right.
And so it's almost, and I remember, I do not want to talk about this very much because this is not where I put my focus. Okay, I want to be very clear in this. But I will say that in the United States recently, you know, in the last few years since 9/11, they passed a law, and I don't even know the name of it. It has to do with terrorism, where they can, if you're suspected of being a terrorist, they can just grab you and take you and throw you into, you know, a prison type situation for as long as they want, and, you know, question you for as long as they want, right?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
What's that? You know, that law when that all came out?
Patriot Act.
The Patriot Act, is that what it is? I don't know.
Wow.
When they were talking about all the details of that. When it first came out, I was like, oh my God, that is the mirror of this document that I read back, you know, I think it was 1990 or 91 that I had that document that came to me. But that document was actually years, you know, it had been written many years before that, maybe in the 60s, 50s or 60s.
Right.
And so this MJ-12 document already had it all laid out. That's what was going to happen. So,
well, it's interesting
it was
because
frightening.
Yeah, it's interesting because you also cite that here you are sitting in a bench, and this very peculiar, out of the ordinary guy dressed in black, who's pretending not to be noticed, is seen by you. And by the way, this obviously is a man in black, as you know, the term is that's been used most of the time, but he appears in front of you, and what strikes a chord here for me was his reaction towards you, because it reminded me of when Patricia Corey, that's one of the guests whom I interviewed a while back, had her psychic experience while being in the Julia Set crop circle in the UK. Now, she had seen different visions all around her, and one of which were men in black who they were walking towards her, looked her way very menacingly, and kept on going. And when I read that passage in your book, it kind of reminded me of what she experienced in the UK. But I wanted to touch upon the reverse engineering aspect on UFO technology. The document also cited that this was being done at the time at Lockheed Martin in California, right?
Oh, well, they again, my memory is starting to. I keep telling everyone I have to go back through my notes. I've got
Sure.
binders and binders of notes that I have to go through, and at some point I really should go back and read them all again. What I know is that they were reverse engineering, and they were talking about, in that document, they did talk about reverse engineering.
Right.
They talked about reverse engineering, and they also talked about the DNA. Not the, was it DNA? Did they call it DNA then? I can't remember if they called it DNA, but they were talking about scientifically studying and seeing what aspects of them they could implement into potentially be used for human beings, and to figure out how they were doing what they were doing. So there was aspects of that that came out. What I know is that the ETs themselves, when I saw them, in '88, they told me that there were scientific discoveries that were going to be made, that were going to be coming out very slowly and made public, that had to do with technology that they had. And they told me that themselves. They told me about, and I'm actually just writing an article on this today, talking about how they were expressing that for health, for example, that different discoveries were going to be made about light therapy, and of course we have red light, blue light that they use in therapies today. Talked about different things along those lines that were going to be coming. And some of it was that technologies regarding their crafts were also going to be coming forward. Now, there was a very short period of time, because I had the experience in late 1988, so we're really talking 90 and 91, okay? So for 2 years, everything was so intense for me. This was when I had the experience of receiving this document from MJ12. Someone had given this to me. People have said to me, "Oh no, I've seen that document. It's all blacked out." I'm like, yeah, this one wasn't blacked out. I had a conversation last year with Stanton Friedman, who is really a deep researcher of MJ12. And again, trying to get his attention and just, talk to him about it, to see if it would spark any further memory of what was in that document, but that hasn't been possible.
Well,
the thing is,
I'm sorry.
The thing is that during that time, those 2 years, that MJ12 document came out, the experience of seeing the ETs on the highway, the experience of the psychic army, and so many other things that you are aware of from the book as well, which I'm sure we'll get into, all happened within a 2-year space of time. And I was completely isolated. So, but the MJ12 document was given to me, and the very next day was when I saw the MIB, and I didn't know what an MIB was. I had no idea what an MIB was. But I was with a guy in Vancouver who was, quote, researching UFOs, and he was down the street, just down the block from me, looking at me, and he wanted to talk to me and introduce me to someone. So he was going to greet the other person, and it was at that time that the MIB walked up and spoke really weirdly to me and just intimidated me is what he did.
Mm-hmm.
And then the researcher came back over, because by then the MIB left, and the researcher and the other man were flipped out because they said, that was an MIB, what the bleep is going on, who are you, I scared them.
Hmm. Well, you also had encounters with clones, right?
Right.
Yeah. What well, let me ask you this. What do you believe your purpose was in meeting them? Was there like a reason behind your encounter with them? Because based from what I read, they just all of a sudden disappeared from your life, so to speak.
Oh yeah, they totally disappeared.
Yeah, it's like you never heard from them again.
No one in the entire community heard from them again after that.
Huh.
Well, that's an interesting question, because I've kind of thought about that. What is it that they did for me, gave to me, or took away from me?
Uh-huh.
And I think they did both. I think they did a few things.
Right.
This is a story that is so interwoven into the community, because I have to give some clarity on the clones. I call them the clones, not because I believe that they physically are cloned, but because they looked so much alike that one would say they're almost identical clones, identical twins,
Right.
Slightly different, but yet the same. And how this happened in a really, really brief overview is this. Somebody that I knew in the community when I first reached out to people in 1990 said, this man wants to talk to you. I told him your story. I said, okay. I met with him. We talked all the time. He was very, very, very odd. Very odd. Just in his everything, his energy, it was just strange. Then we got to be kind of friends a little bit, and he would bring me all sorts of different information, and it would seem like classified information. It was very interesting. He seemed to have an inside knowledge somewhere, and I couldn't figure out where. And this was when I was first getting into this, back in just after my experience in '88. Okay, so I started a, quote, abduction group that didn't last very long because it got really convoluted, partly because of the clones and other military-type people that were showing up at it. It was kind of creepy. And what happened was, number one, I'm going to number them. The number one guy came, and he was taking part in our sessions. And then that was it. Now, number one clone was the one that gave me the document for MJ12. Okay? And came to me and said, I work in an office with about 8 other guys or something like that, 7 or 8 other guys, I think it was 8. 8 other guys who all are into UFOs, and we share all of the information that we find, and this recently came to me, and I felt that you had a right to know what they can do to you if they find out that you've had this experience. So this is what they're planning. And I was like, okay. So he gave me the MJ12. He said, whatever you do, do not photocopy it, do not copy it, and show it to no one. He said, I am putting my own life at risk by giving this to you, is what he said. So I was like, okay. Took the document, and I read it. And then right after that, the next day, I had the MIB experience. My boyfriend's apartment, who we were at, with the document had been absolutely torn apart.
Ransacked.
Yeah. Ransacked, thank you. Ransacked. My boyfriend never talked to me again after that. He said, I can't deal with this, you've got to go, which was really heartbreaking for both of us. But what else happened, and I want to get this going too, because this man was always traveling from Vancouver to California, and from California to Russia. Okay? Now, Lockheed Martin was in California, and Lockheed Martin is known in the, in our alternative community to be a facilitator of reverse engineering of UFO technologies. Then he would go to Russia, and this man, Clone One, told me that he would always travel with someone from his office. Okay, when all of this happened, MJ-12, the document, MIB, Russians. The other thing that happened was a couple of people came up from California one day when I was working, walked into the little yogurt shop that I worked at, didn't say a blessed word to me, walked right up to me, looked me in the eye, and said, "It is an honor and a privilege to finally meet you." And he put his hand out to shake my hand. I had no idea who he was. He told me that him and his girlfriend were from California, and they told me that they worked at Lockheed.
Interesting.
And they had only come up for a couple of days, but they just had to meet me. Now, shortly after this guy, Clone One, was going to all of these trips to Russia was when the Russians came up as well. You see?
Right.
Okay. Then by this time, with all of these things plus more that had happened, I said, that's it. Someone's going to kill me if I keep talking to people. It was just too insane. None of my mail would be delivered. If I mailed something to someone, it wouldn't show up. If people mailed it to me, all of my mail was blatantly ripped open, or it just wouldn't show up. And I know that was happening.
Wow.
So, to finish this, what happened to this first part of the story was that I went to Victoria, which is, a small community on Vancouver Island. I left Vancouver. When I was there, a woman from Vancouver called me and said, "I met this guy. You really have to meet him. He's insistent." And I said, "I don't want to talk to anybody from the community." She goes, "You have to meet this man. He has a lot of information." I said, "Okay." He showed up at my house in Victoria, and I almost fell over. I almost fainted. Because he looked identical with his hair color, his hair cut, his hairstyle, his glasses, his skin tone, his eyes, the shape of his face, and even the way that he dressed. He wore these beige, like cargo pants that we call them now. The same as Clone Number One. At the very end of this day, without saying anything, at the very end of this day, the guy gives me his business card and says, "Contact me if you ever come back into Vancouver." And I looked at him, and I looked at the card, and the name on the card was the same company that Clone One worked at. When I said to this man, and I quote, "Who the HELL are you?" He said, "What do you mean?" I said, "You work with so-and-so. Who are you people? What are you doing?" And I flipped out on him. He said, "I don't know who that is." I said, I started to swear at him. I said, "Yes, you damn well do know who this is. You do work with him." I said, "Yes, and I know." And I started to say a few things, and he goes, oh, yeah, I know such and such. But not until I really made it clear, "Don't mess with me. I know who you are." He tried to push it out. So then I was the only one in the community at this point who saw these two men. A few months later, in 1991, I went to the very first UFO Congress conference ever that took place in Tucson, Arizona. Very first one. And I went with a woman from the Vancouver community. And when we were there, we saw two, not one, but two more of these men that looked like clones. And I never said anything to this girl. But we shared the same hotel room, and she flipped out because she was up in the room, and she the first or second day that she was there, she sat up and she said, "Oh my God, did you see this man walking around? It's like he's a clone of man number 2, because she only knew man number 2. You see?
Right.
So now there's 4 of them that look the same, dress the same, act the same, talk the same. And here's an even scarier part. They were all into UFO technology. That's what they wanted to know. What do you know about UFO technology? Tell us everything you know. Tell us everything you know. And so that's the story of the clones. So that was the last straw for me.
Right.
You know, I was done.
Right. Well, you eventually decide to embark on not one but several journeys to the southwest area of the United States. And in the process, you encounter several people with whom you establish a connection. Now, without going too much into detail here, because I'd like to reserve more on this for the second hour, are you able to tell the listeners here why the Four Corners area of the U.S., in this case it's Utah, Colorado, Arizona, and New Mexico, is considered as a safe haven? I mean, that's a pretty sensitive area, because it's my understanding that there is a military base called Dulce in New Mexico that's just in that vicinity. So when I read this, it was like, well, this is kind of ironic, because on the one hand, you have the deep underground military base, and then you have the understanding that this is a safe area should something, let's say, happen, such as, let's say, a possible nuclear war, or something happening, to, let's say, with the sun, like a solar flare hitting the earth and so forth. Can you share your thoughts as to why the ETs told you this would be a safe area, among many other places, of course?
Well, they didn't necessarily, that I remember. Well, that's a loaded question in so many ways, because it's so many things. Okay, what they said was that the Four Corners area, right, that little area there, was going to be what they called the safe lands. But they didn't say that was the safe land. They said that was one of the safe lands. What does that mean? Well, it was a place where, when and if the strife came into the future, it would be one of the safe areas to be in. But how and why it's safe, you know, because I've been asked this about, quote, nuclear war before, and I can only imagine that somewhere, somehow, the potential for great catastrophe to come to the planet has already been foreseen in these futuristic visions, and that this is one of the areas that withstands it. Now, maybe it's because the entire region there is very heavily populated by profoundly traditional and what some call indigenous peoples, with people that are still focused on living on the land in a very natural way. They still have the natural, you know, traditional medicines and teachings, and most importantly, I believe, that they have spiritual strength. So it is ironic that Dulce is there, and there's been a lot of speculation and talk that Dulce is an underground military base that is not a good place for us. I myself has had an astral experience, not a physical, but an astral experience, where I was shown certain things in Dulce with one of the beings that I have connection with, and they told me to never go there. They said, do not ever come to this area because it's dangerous.
Right.
So there is an irony here, and is the irony that, and I really get upset when people say, you're being led by negative aliens that are, you know, that deal with Dulce, and I'm like, listen, educate yourself on what's being said by myself, because that is not the case. I was told to stay away from Dulce. I was not told to ever go there. And after what I saw there, I would never, I mean, I can't even imagine I don't think that I could go there. I don't think that I could physically get into a car and knowingly drive even close to the place that Dulce is at. I think I would probably have a breakdown. It was so horrible, what I saw there. So what is the reason for that being, quote, a safe land? I guess a little bit of knowledge from the people that live in the region would imply that it's because of the sacredness and because of the knowledge that they have of the land and the earth there itself, and what can be provided for in an environment like that.
Right, that's what I was thinking myself, because the area could be considered as a sacred spot, like many other sacred spots on the planet with the energy vortex. You've been to Sedona. You felt the vibe there, right? So I'm thinking along those terms that possibly this was one of the areas selected by the ETs should the foreseeable happen. So yeah, okay, so Miriam, we are approaching the end of the first hour here. Would you care to remind our listeners once again on how they can reach you?
They can reach me through my website, bluestarprophecy.com. I also have a PDF of my book available for a reasonable charge, and it helps to support the work that I do with different peoples around the world, and mostly the indigenous communities. So I also have an email, Miriam at bluestarprophecy.com, if anyone would like to contact me, and I'm also on Facebook and Twitter.
Great. Awesome. Well, I appreciate you taking the time here to chat with me for the first hour, Miriam, and I look forward to talking to you for the second hour, okay?
Thank you.
All right. Take care. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.
That's it for the first hour on As Above, So Below Radio. Tune in for the second hour by subscribing to HolisticAdvocate.com, where Miriam will further discuss her perspective on the Hopi people and their connection to the stars, how beings genetically modified the human body, the different worlds that existed prior to this one, and the Blue Star Prophecy and its importance to the planet, and much more. You're listening to As Above, So Below Radio.